3, we're going to dive into doing a lot of fun things involved with shooting today. For the project for this week, you're going to be doing a lot of stuff focused on framing. And so we thought we probably should tell you at least a few things, a few tips about framing. And as with anything, there are some rules that we can give you, some basic ideas and concepts. But when it comes to filmmaking, a lot of the time you'll see people breaking all these rules. But I think it's really important that you learn the rules ahead of time. You know what they are, you know what they do, and why we have them and call them rules. But then also that will kind of give you some license to, when you do break them, at least you'll know why you're breaking the rules, and that way you can communicate the story better. So the first thing we're going to do when we talk about framing, we're going to talk about the rule of thirds. And it's a very simple thing. We'll show you it on camera here in just a minute. But let's just pretend for a minute that this is the frame on your camera. Usually everything's shooting at 16:9 these days. So when you go to a film or a movie, you're used to seeing a widescreen, so that should not look like anything particularly new to you. So now what we're talking about is rule of thirds. So the idea of rule of thirds is that you take your frame, and let's just pretend you've had magic lines that you could see that go over this, and you're cutting your frame into basically 9 pieces. You got 3 across this way and 3 down this way. And you have this nice little grid that's going over your frame. The rule of thirds starts out and says everything that happens in the scene needs to balance around these points right here, these 4 connecting points. So when you're shooting, you don't actually have a grid on your camera usually that has this, so you kind of have to imagine here's the points. But the idea is you're going to take these points and say, all right, everything that happens in the scene is going to happen right here. So for an example, let's go ahead and draw a scene right here. We could start out a scene. All right, and here's, Bob, and Bob is standing here, here's his arms, and he's just right there in the middle of the scene. Yay, Bob is talking. But let's say what's really going on, let's draw what's really going on, is Bob is down here, and he's having a conversation with his big-headed friend Jeff, and he's there, and they're just talking to each other. But if we go to this shot with Bob, and then we decide, let's do the same shot with the other guy, and they're both here, well then we're cutting right on top of each other. So suddenly you're seeing Bob in the middle, and next you're seeing his friend, and then Bob, and then his friend, and then Bob, and it can get really confusing because they're just in the middle of the frame. It's not particularly interesting, and it gets kind of confusing when we're just cutting back and forth. It's like their eyes and their faces are changing, but it's the same shot. So what we could do then is we have our rule of thirds. So what we could do is we could say, all right, here's our shot, but we're gonna do our rule of thirds, and let's put our friend Bob in the rule of thirds. So Bob's head is going to be approximately right here, right? So his head, this dot, would be somewhere right around here, and we're going to try to make Bob's eyes right there, and we're going to put him on the left side because this is Bob. We'll put Bob over here. Bob is on the left side, so we're going to kind of line him up on the left side of the frame so that when he is talking, guess what? He's right there in the rule of thirds. He's lined up with the line vertically this way, and his eyes are going to be landing on that point right there. And that's great. So then we can actually flip it around and do the other shot and put his friend over here, except this time his friend's going to be over here. Now notice his friend's head is right over here. It's going to be in the rule of third here, and his eyes are going to be on the same spot, but he's on the right side. So suddenly when we're cutting between these 2 shots, it looks really good because Bob is on the left. Every time we see Bob, he's on the left looking across the way. And it looks nice and balanced because then when we cut to his friend is always on the right side and their eyes are on the same spot. We would not want to have a shot where we come to Bob's friend and then Bob's friend is down on this rule of thirds. Right, there's his head and he's looking down. So suddenly this would look weird because he is looking over at his friend whose eyes should be around that height. But now we're cutting and instead he's on the bottom third. That is not going to work at all. So you want to basically use the rule of thirds to balance your shot. Your action and your people, even your objects really need to land somewhere on these 4 points in the rule of thirds, and that way they have a nice balance and their eye lines are the same. So let's pretend we were going to get an establishing shot here of our wide shot of our 2 friends talking. Notice if I'm doing the frame, I'm going to put the frame approximately right here because this, boom, their eyes are right there and they're hitting the rule of thirds. So in a conversation, it's not surprising to see 2 people together and their heads being right there in those 2 particular spots. It makes it look very nice and balanced. It's very cinematic. It looks like a movie. It looks like, wow, this was thought through. It's all balanced together and it's looking good. So the first thing we want to talk about, that's rule of thirds. And so we're going to jump out of this little spot for a second. I'm going to show you on camera what rule of thirds looks like and why it works. Okay, so we're going to look a little bit at framing our 2 volunteers here. We've got our 2 buds here. We have Josh and Avery. Avery, scoot in a little bit for me. Perfect, there we go. And we're going to kind of show you an example of the things that we're talking about. So let's start with the rule of thirds. So on my camera, if I'm going to do the rule of thirds properly, if I start out here, they're already kind of nice. So if we pretend for just a moment that there's a line going across each side and we've cut it into thirds, then again, I'm going for those 2 dots that we have that cross the upper third and the 2 side thirds. And so in this particular shot that I'm framing right here, we've got Avery and Josh. Their eyes are both on the same dots, and they're, look at that, the rule of thirds, and they're nice and balanced. The frame is nice and balanced and everything like that. Let's give you an example of an unbalanced, not rule of thirds shot. So if I were to zoom in like this, okay. Now, the thing about this particular shot is that not only is it unbalanced, but that Josh is not anywhere near thirds. Their head is approximately in the middle of the frame. It doesn't look very good. And Avery has no side room at all. And so he's going to look a little bit squished in the frame as you're looking at it. He looks, you know, uncomfortable so because we've not giving him any room to work in. Let's look at also another way to look at a rule of thirds problem. That would not be okay. Now this is rule of thirds. You'll notice if we had it, boom, right there. That'll do. Now, this is rule of thirds. Their eyes are on the bottom third, and so they are lined up where they need to be, and they are lined up with their eye lines on that line, except for the fact that we're on the bottom line. And you'll notice, look how awkward the shot is. I mean, it looks like we could park an airplane above them. It just doesn't look very good at all. There you go, Josh, you guys waving around. So here's the deal. You got to make sure when you're doing your rule of thirds, the goal is to have a nice, balanced, good-looking shot, and this right here would not work. So if we had them pretend to talk for a second, as an audience, if we were looking at this, this is going to be really awkward to watch. We're not going to like it. So when we talk about rule of thirds for the opening shot, we want to do it like this. Here we go. We've got the 2 guys together. All right. Rule of thirds, their eyes are together. That's the shot we kind of want to start with. It looks nice. It's balanced. Their eye lines are together. And it looks good. Now let's zoom in. Let's pretend they're having a conversation. So we want to zoom in. We want to get the first guy and then go to the other guy, right? So for rule of thirds, we're going to do the same thing. We'll zoom in here. Here's Josh's face. Now notice this is an approximate good rule of thirds. He's on the left side of the frame. His eye line is on that upper third. You can practically imagine where the line is, and he is talking. And so if we wanted to take a shot and we wanted to cut between this shot and his buddy, we would start with this shot here, and now we'll move over and notice that's a proper third of Avery. So we could cut them together and just notice how easy that looks. He's talking, then we move over to this shot. He is talking. Yeah, everything's good. They're playing guitars. And then he's talking, and we have a nice rule of thirds. Now here's something that we would not want to do, is we would not want to do it like this. All right, guys, pretend to talk for me again. So here's Avery. Notice he's in the middle. This shot looks uncomfortable. I mean, it's just completely uncomfortable. It doesn't make sense. If we move over to Josh, this does not look well thought through at all. Look at all the space around him. We don't know what he's talking about, and that's just not really good. So when we talk about rule of thirds, again, it's a nice balance to think, all right, there's my grid, and there he is talking. And then there's the cut to Avery, and they're talking together, and it looks really nice. We can film a nice conversation with those 3 shots. All right, another thing we want to talk about is headroom. When you're taking your camera, where we're going to put somebody's head and how much space you're going to give that person's head in the frame. And it can be really confusing sometimes because you think, well, let's just put them right in the middle. But as we looked at it a second ago, that doesn't always look really good. So let's draw Bob again. There he is. Look at Bob. Oh, he's fantastic. There he goes. Look at this. You should be glad we're not teaching an art class because our art is awful. But anyhow, all right, so here we go. We got Bob, and let's say we're going to frame Bob up, and we can use the rule of thirds or whatever. What we would want to do, naturally, is to basically draw our box. You know, here's our frame, and here's Bob, and it's not quite perfect rule of thirds, but let's just pretend. That's where his head is. But when we talk about headroom, we're talking about this space right here. How much headroom do you want to give Bob? Now, if you take the camera and you push the camera so that the top of the camera is right here, and then this line wasn't there, well, suddenly this is going to be really cramped. We're going to be like, why is his head at the very top of the frame? It's kind of crushing his head. There's no headroom there, and we're going to feel like, man, it's really tight and confining. We kind of feel like it's not quite balanced. We want to see that, okay, there is at least something above his head. Or to the same extent, if we put Bob's head, if we were to redraw this, let's just put Bob and pretend he's over here. If we put Bob right here, but the top of the frame is up here, this is just way too much headroom. We're going to look at that and be like, why is Bob's head so low in the frame? Why is he not taking up more? It's not balanced. His head isn't in the right spot. We have all this space. Why are we showing all this space? Is he about to put on like 15 hats or something? What's the deal? And it's just gonna look a little bit awkward. So there's a nice little space. We wanna give some headroom, but we don't wanna give too much headroom. So to show you an example of headroom and what is good headroom versus what is maybe too much headroom or not enough headroom, we're gonna use our little example models, and I'm gonna show it to you right now and give you a little better idea of what it is. Now let's talk a little bit about headroom. We were just discussing headroom and about where it is. So let's look at our friend Josh here for a second. Josh, go ahead and look at us for the camera. There he is, he looks nice, okay? We put him in the center of the frame for this. There he is. Notice the headroom. The camera is not chopping his head off. His hair is there, but you do see a little bit of air above him, but he looks comfortable. It looks like, hey, this might be a good picture if we were out taking a picture. Now, if I do this to poor Josh, and I'm like, all right, now we have Josh. Now look at that. It looks awkward. It's like, why is there so much space above him? If he's looking up, he's like, what's gonna happen? Is something going to drop on me? It just looks awkward and very, very uncomfortable. In the same sense, if we were to zoom in and do this kind of thing on Josh, boom. Now Josh has no headroom and we're chopping his hair completely off at the top of the frame. This is also uncomfortable. We're wondering, why can't we see his whole head? Is it something about his hair we don't want to see? Why are we doing this? And so we don't want to do it like that either. So we need to leave enough headroom around like this. This would be a nice solid shot. There's enough headroom where we're not cutting him off, but at the same time, there's not too much headroom. We're expecting something to fall on him. And so this looks really good. If we were to put them both in the scene with the rule of thirds, this is a great amount of headroom. Notice the scene looks balanced. They're on their rule of thirds. Their eye lines are the same. There's a little space above them. You're not going to see it like this. This is awkward. This doesn't look good at all. This is just all kinds of weird. Same with this. This would be, again, too much. It's going to look uncomfortable. If they're pretending to have a conversation, it's just not going to look very good. We're going to want to know at what point is the spaceship going to abduct them, because there's just too much headroom. Okay, another thing we want to talk about as far as framing goes is what we call looking space. And let me describe what looking space is. We're going to put Bob. We've been getting our money out of Bob here. He's working for us today. Bob's got his friend over here. All right. And they're having a conversation, and we're wanting to film the conversation, okay? And for this purpose, let's give Bob some hair so that you can kind of see what's going on. So Bob's got really horrible curly hair, all right? So they're having this conversation, and when we look at them, we want to see that, guess what? Bob is looking this way, and his friend is looking that way. And they're having this conversation, they're looking at each other. So if we were to frame them up together, this is really simple, because we can just kind of frame them up in the scene, they're having a conversation, and everything's looking good. But what happens when we want to cut and get a closer shot of Bob and a close-up shot of his friend? Well, that's when we get to looking space. So here's the situation. Here's our frame on the camera, and we have Bob. Now we know, because we have an establishing shot, that Bob is on the left, he's talking to his friend who's on the right, and so he's looking to the right of the camera. So we're expecting Bob to look to the right of the camera. But this would look awkward. If Bob is here, there he is, right, with his curly hair. But let's pretend that Bob is looking this way, right? The rest of the frame, we might be following the rule of thirds, right? We put him over here, he's on thirds, his eye line is in the right spot. But Bob is looking that way. This is going to look awkward to us because we can't see, there's no space for us telling us, okay, wait, what is he looking at? Why is the film here? We want the camera to move over and put it like this so that Bob would be more like this. And then he's looking that way. It gives us all this looking space where we can say, hey, he's looking at something. If we left him here with the camera edge being right here, it's going to drive everybody crazy, because we're going to know, why is the screen right here and his nose right here and he's looking at something that we, the audience, can't see. And the same thing would happen if we took his friend. We expect his friend, if here's our frame over here, we expect our frame to be right here. Here's our friend. He's got rule of thirds. He's looking this way, and he's got all this looking space to go over there. He is not right here looking that way. If he was, then that's going to drive everybody insane. So make sure that when you're filming stuff, just like headroom is important, your looking space is important. You always need to keep your characters where your establishing shot puts them. If they start out on the left side and the right side, then they need to stay on whatever side they start on. And when they talk about it right here and they're going and you're going to cut into the shots, make sure that you cut into the shots and you leave them the proper looking space so that there's a nice big comfortable barrier between them. They have plenty of space in the frame to look off, and that way we know, yes, they're looking at something, it's the other person, but they're not just looking at the edge of the frame of the camera. So let's not do that. If we're doing looking space, this is the way, guys, go ahead and pretend to have a conversation. If Josh is over here talking, but this is him, we know that Josh is on the left side, we know that Avery's over here on the right side, and yet if I frame Josh like this, even though he's kind of fitting the rule of thirds and he's got a little bit of headroom and it doesn't look bad, this is uncomfortable because we're wondering, why is he looking so close to the edge of the camera? We naturally feel like this is better because now he's got some head space, we're not cramping him, we're not making it look awkward, it just looks so much better this way. So we should definitely do it this way. Same for Avery. If we go over here to Avery, this would be a really, really uncomfortable scene, and not just because our air adapter in the background has fallen out of the wall, but it's uncomfortable because Avery's nose is right next to the edge of the frame. It's gonna look uncomfortable. So what we need to do is come over to right here, and notice just how easy that is. Provides plenty of looking space. They're looking back and forth, and it's just gonna look really good. And finally, we need to discuss one last rule. It's really important, and it's called the 180 rule. And this is one of the rules that no one really tries to break this rule, because when you do, this is the one that will get you in the most trouble if you break this rule. So let me explain what that is. We're gonna pretend that we have, a drone or a bird's eye view of a scene, okay? So let's put our man Bob on here and his friend, and they're having a conversation. So here's Bob, and here's his friend, okay? And we're looking down on them from above, so that's why there's no other arms or legs, okay? So here they are, and they're talking, and let's say we're gonna put the camera, we're gonna get an establishing shot, okay? So let's pretend, we'll just put the camera, here it is. It's down there, and it's shooting this way, all right? Here's what they're showing, and it's showing, there's our shot, and we have all the kind of stuff going on, and the camera's there. Let's say we wanna get another camera, and we wanna get just his face, and we're gonna leave plenty of face room. So let's put another camera over here. Right, boom, here's another camera, and it's gonna shoot right here. All right, and then let's even say we just have tons of cameras laying around, and we can do more. We're gonna put one more camera over here, okay? And this camera is gonna shoot right here, between there and there. So now we've got one camera getting both of them, one camera focusing on Bob, and one camera focusing on Bob's friend, right? And so far, everything is fine, everything is gonna look good. When we go into cutting, we've got an establishing shot, we've got a close-up shot from the two side cameras of both of our people, and so we have 3 shots to work with, and we can cut them all together, and everything is fine. Now here's what you would absolutely not want to do, and why we call it the 180 rule. We're gonna pretend that we put a line between the camera and our people. All right, all the cameras, and in essence, the audience is going to be on this side of the line. Everything that is on that side of the line is opposite the 180 rule, because you've got your degrees. You've got 90 over here, and then when we bring it up here, this is 180 degrees. It's just a straight line across the actors. So what you do not want to do is you never, ever, ever want to take a camera and decide, let's put a camera right here, and I'm going to start cutting the scene, and we're going to put them suddenly on this side. Because now it's going to look really messed up, because 1 second Bob is going to be on the left side of the frame. Here he is, and he's going to be talking this way, and then when you cut to this camera, suddenly Bob is now on the right side of the frame talking to the left, and the audience is going to be, what's going on? Why? Wait a minute, he was just over here talking, and now he's over here talking this way, and it can be really confusing. So whenever you're shooting a scene, you always want to keep all of your cameras on this side of the line, the 180 degree line. You never want to, you can get your camera, you can bring it all the way up to here, but once you hit this line, that is where you need to stop and not put your camera any further. You don't want to flip around and put the camera way back behind here. It just gets really confusing when you go into editing. It's going to look a little awkward. We can show you some examples of it, but you're not really going to find it in movies very much, because no one's doing this in a film, because it gets too confusing. Unless, of course, you're doing one of those wraparound scenes where it's all one take and you're going to run the camera around somebody and then end up back over here. You might be able to pull it off in one shot. But when you're shooting a scene, it's really important that you set this line early. Wherever your actors are, wherever the action is, needs to be on one side, and all your cameras and angles need to be on the other side. That's the 180 degree rule. That's the rule you should not be breaking in this class. It will throw you off and mess up your project every single time, so don't do it. We're gonna show you just one other thing. Guys, could you kind of come up here real quick to right here? We talked about the 180 rule a little bit, and I just kind of want to show you an example here of the 180. We're going to leave this camera for just a second, and we're going to focus primarily on this camera. I'm going to show you. So let's pretend that these guys are here and they're talking. I'm going to go handheld for this example. Move this out of the way. So here we go, guys. So we're here, they're having this conversation. Let's say we have a camera, we've got a wide shot, and everything in the shot is looking nice and crisp, and they're talking. Notice the rule of thirds. They're both fitting in really nicely. If I wanted to zoom in and maybe move the camera over to this side of the room and zoom in on Josh, notice again, rule of thirds is here. Nice headroom, nice looking space. He's fine. We can move over to here. We can get Avery, a close-up of Avery. He's talking, he's looking just fine as well. Now, what we don't want to do is if they're having this conversation, we absolutely do not want to suddenly spin around and have Josh over here. Because wait a minute, this is gonna look, while it looks pretty, suddenly we're like, why is the camera way over here? It's not going to look right. And especially if we just kept going, we're like, okay, suddenly here's Josh with a light in the background, and Josh is talking. This is not going to make a whole lot of sense if we're cutting between the shots, because we know Josh is supposed to be on the left. Because when we started, boom, here he is. Josh was on the left. So that is why you don't want to break the 180-degree rule. It looks really awkward. So when you're filming, it's really important that you keep track of all these things. You want to make sure the framing looks good, that you're leaving plenty of headspace above them, but not too much headspace. You want to make sure that everything's lining up on the rule of thirds. You definitely don't want to break the 180 rule. And so it's really good when you're filming your scenes to keep this kind of stuff. This is just basic filmmaking stuff. So you want to keep it in your brain. Make sure you're using these things when you film. And so now that we've seen that, let's look at a couple other things.